images, and required a lot of imagination. One of his favorites at the time was a mud called Non-Event, and it heavily inspired him. Andrew wanted to create an online medieval multiplayer video gaming experience that was similar, but he wanted it to actually have graphics instead of just being a traditional mud. With his background knowledge in creating muds as well as Java games, he knew that he could achieve this. One of Andrew's friends named Pete introduced him to a graphical mud called Ultima Online. However, Andrew never actually got to play it, and he would later state that that was probably a good thing, so Devious Mud didn't come out too similar. During this year, on his webpage, Andrew described this project as a mammoth task. He began redesigning all of the internal file formats that were used to make the game much more extendable and easier to edit. He continued on to say that this is taking a long time, but should be worth the effort. When I've finished this, it'll be very easy for anyone to add new monsters, new objects, new blocks, new maps, new skills, new quests, new spells, etc. When he used the term anyone to add new anything, I assume he means those he chooses to work on the game with him. As of right now of this year though, Andrew is the only one working on Devious Mud. Devious Mud would not go online until next year in 1999 on a website ran by Andrew called Cunning and Devious Games. It is now 1999, and Devious Mud has now been completely rewritten by Andrew with the help of his brothers Ian and Paul Gower. During this year, Andrew Gower owned a website that could be found at the URL of cunninganddeviousgames.com. This website would feature 5 games with Devious Mud included. Among their most popular games on the site at the time was a game called Grinders, in which you'd use a joystick to draw a line on the game screen, avoiding obstacles against a second player that was to be your opponent until one of you failed and the other one had gained a point. Another popular game was Destruction Imminent, a single-player first-person shooter game with multiple weapons in which you travel levels of dungeons, killing bug-like creatures and humanoid monsters, as well as dodging and destroying machinery such as turrets and robots through each level. These 2 games and the others on the website were available at the price of £10 and were to be sold on a floppy disk. Apart from his Cunning and Devious Games website, Andrew also had his own personal webpage called Andrew's Homepage. However, I do not know what the URL to it was. On his website though, he would have different subject categories on the page that people could browse. For example, under the Fireworks category, Andrew shows off his first effort into writing programs in DirectX. Fireworks was a screensaver he had developed and shared with others during this year. Within the Atari Zone, Fractals, Bottomless Pit, Penguins, and Ray Tracing categories, you could find other games that Andrew had made. Something else interesting, under the Music category, was a little brother-like program in relation to Devious Mud called Cunning Mod. Essentially, Cunning Mod was a library for DJGPP, a development tool used to compile files. In other words, Cunning Mod was basically a sound library and media player program that would work together with a compiler program when it came to adding music and sounds into programs like games that were still under development. The argument for Cunning Mod being a little brother program to Devious Mud was that both of these programs were later taken down within a week of each other during this year. Going back to Devious Mud, Andrew's biggest project among the others at the time, there was Devious Mud Alpha and Devious Mud Beta. The Alpha was the first version that was never released to the public, as Andrew felt it wasn't ready, and the Beta was the second version that was released publicly for about a week before Andrew decided to scrap it. While the Beta was public, Andrew had his friend he met through his part-time job he had at Games Domain try out Devious Mud. That person was Rob Law, otherwise known as Rab, who would later become the first RuneScape player ever, but more on that later. Rab also convinced some of his other friends to try out Devious Mud as well, those people being Lightning, Merlin, and Guge. There was loads to do, and much of the game was unfinished and had a lot of bugs. Andrew stated that he made this version of Devious Mud in his bedroom before Jagex and everything that Jagex entailed later on. Only half of one quest was done at the time, called Sheep Shearer. There were also about 2 half-finished shops in the game, and only about 10 objects. Some of the bugs listed were being able to force an NPC through walls when fighting them, characters not facing each other when talking, it was hard to go up and down stairs, items of armor that should have totally obscured any clothing underneath didn't yet, you could talk to NPCs that were running away from your attacks, and much, much more. Towards the end of Devious Mud, a quest compiler was finished, but didn't support many commands. The player-to-player conversation system was worked on heavily, but still itself wasn't finished, and Andrew had finished designing a wooded forest area to the left of the starting zone. Devious Mud did have a resizable game screen though, which is something that RuneScape wouldn't have until a decade later. A server could also hold 2,500 players at the time, more than even one RuneScape server can hold today. At the end of it all on this year on March 28th, one of the last written updates for Devious Mud by Andrew Gower stated as follows: "Fix some more bugs. I've not got as much done as I would have liked, but I'm putting it online anyway. I've put the beta version of Devious Mud online and a few people have tried it out. However, I'm having another break from writing it to give me some more time to do other Java games that I'm working on. It's not really anywhere near finished yet, so I've removed the address from this page. Try again in a few months' time." During Devious Mud's time online, there were about 20 players that played it. After graduating university, Andrew was offered 2 jobs, one with his friends over at Games Domain, and another from a man named Constant Tedder, who owned a competitor towards Games Domain called GamesWire. Towards the end of this year, Andrew and his brothers Ian and Paul decided to go it alone though, and began trading under a new name other than Cunning and Devious Games. Cunning and Devious Games came to an end, and the new name that they eventually decided on was Jagex. It stood for a variety of things: Java Audio and Graphics Extension, Java Gaming Experts, as well as just about the gaming experience. Jagex had finally been born. Y2K has happened and the world hasn't ended, but Devious Mud has, and a new game from Andrew was underway. After throwing ideas around, and of course checking that the domain name was free, the brothers decided on the name RuneScape for their new game. Its original logo was actually just the name in stones without the sword like we see today, but the brothers' friends had some fun with that first idea, calling the game Run Escape and not its actual name, so the sword was eventually added between Rune and Scape later on by Ian. Commonly practiced while developing MUD games at this time, to make adding content into them easier, developers used scripting systems. Paul and Ian Gower came up with great ideas for the game at this time, but they came up with ideas much faster than Andrew could implement them. So, Andrew created his own scripting system that Paul and Ian themselves could use to implement his ideas into the game to alleviate some of the imbalance. That system became known as RuneScript. After Paul learned how to use RuneScript and the map editor, he eventually made Lumbridge Castle the starting point for the game. The first NPC ever added was actually a sheep, and if you look here at the sheep from Devious Mud, you can see lots of similarities. Another NPC that Paul first created that would wander around Lumbridge Castle would be Hans. From there, the cook's assistant quest was born as well. In fact, the sounds that were in the game were mainly recorded from real life, like opening and closing doors and cooking. Cooking anything on a fire or a range in RuneScape at this time was actually the recorded sound of Andrew Gower's mother cooking bacon in a skillet. She even drew 4 monsters for him, those being a camel, a bear, a spider, and a bat, and they were all put into the game. Much of the game's graphics and playstyle mechanics were inspired by other games such as LucasArts' Monkey Island and Day of the Tentacle that were popular at this time as well. Announcing to Games Domain that RuneScape was almost ready for launch, he recruited some people who had earlier played Devious Mud. Once again, Rab was back, testing another project for the Gower brothers. Excluding the brothers, he was the first player to ever sign up for RuneScape. Lightning, Gugge, and Merlin were back as well. Rab was actually given Jagex moderator privileges and helped to moderate the game once it had released to the public after a testing period in March of this year. At this time, in-game moderator crowns did not exist yet, so players wouldn't be able to tell who was a moderator and who wasn't. The game did have bugs, and sometimes players would get stuck somewhere, so moderators were required when Andrew, Ian, and Paul weren't online. Rab's Jagex moderator account was simply just called Moderator. Also copied over from Devious Mud was much of the Mud's map ideals. Places like Varrock, Al-Kharid, Falador, and Port Sarim were also copied over in concept. Rab learned how to use the RuneScript scripting system too, and actually wrote the Romeo and Juliet quest during this year, around 4 to 5 months before the release of RuneScape to the public at the beginning of 2001. Rab stated in 2010 that he wrote the quest partly because there were a few people speaking about quest writing, and he thought that if an outsider wrote one, then perhaps others would too, and the game would receive a bigger community due to this. Rab also had a hand in creating the Prince Ali rescue quest and the Dorix quest as well. Feeling satisfied with the amount of content that had been placed into the game by the Gower brothers at Jagex and their friends, RuneScape was ready for launch on one playable server game world to the public. It's January 4th, 2001, and the pressure was on. One playable server that could only hold 2,000 players turned out to be a big undersight, and the Gower brothers were overwhelmed, having to set up more game worlds to take on the extra players, as they didn't want to turn anyone away that wanted to play. Frantically working against the clock, Andrew kept having to re-engineer the servers to keep up with the number of players being registered. When players did register, they had a few options when creating their players. Character types used to exist as bonuses when starting, but your account became more rounded the more you progressed later on, catching up with whatever bonus you chose when you started. These categories were Adventure, Warrior, Wizard, Ranger, and Miner. For example, if you chose Wizard, you'd get more runes when you started out, and your 2 magic levels would be a little boosted. If you chose Miner, your level would be boosted as well, and you'd get a pickaxe, but it wouldn't be bronze. Specific metal types of items such as pickaxes back then didn't exist yet. Only one specific pickaxe did, and it was just called Pickaxe. Also, when you started, you wouldn't be on Tutorial Island, as it didn't exist yet either, and wouldn't until next year. This was actually the location that you started, outside of Lumbridge Castle, as well as your respawn point if you happened to die. Compared to the RuneScape Classic versions later in 2002 and 2003, there was actually a lot missing in the first few months of 2001. For example, the Report Abuse button didn't exist yet. The area Misthalin was the only area in the game that existed at the time, and the Asgarnia area was added later in the year. Banks weren't released until the 23rd of January this year, 19 days after the release of the game. Even with Banks releases though, players still had to keep all of their items on them because the banks would only hold coins at the time. And speaking of coins, the max amount that you could hold in a single inventory slot and one bank slot was 65,535 coins, and the same number cap applied to all stackable items during this time as well. Because of this, PKers would often work together with skillers, having them hold their cash stacks while they risked all their other items PKing, which you could also do anywhere in the game at this time because the wilderness didn't exist yet. When you were fighting, it was mandatory for both players to hit each other 3 times before being able to retreat, so the goal was to kill your opponent in 3 hits before they could flee, and the same rule applied to combat with NPCs as well. Next month in February, an option was created for players where they could toggle whether or not they wanted their account to be a player killer or a non-player killer, and this could be switched a few times before you got stuck with one of the categories. Looking at this screenshot from Blue Rose 13X in 2001, you'll notice a number of differences on the stat menu as well. For starters, the font is different compared to the later RSC stat menu. Magic and prayer were divided into 2 skills, pray good and pray evil, good magic and evil magic. Tailoring was a skill in which you'd craft armor, but this was later merged with the crafting skill, which at this time, the crafting skill itself, was in the game but didn't actually work yet. Your influence skill was raised by completing quests, so it was basically an early version of quest points. Influence granted you perks with NPCs just as quest points do today. The fishing and fletching skills also hadn't been released yet. Thieving was on the stats menu, but also didn't work properly, much like crafting. On the equipment status portion of the menu, there was a hiding bonus as well. Hiding was an equipment bonus that existed briefly, and it was intended to help keep aggressive monsters away from the player by reducing the monster's chances of noticing you. It was on the equipment status list, but was never actually implemented. Instead, at this time, you could use a good magic spell called Camouflage that would hide you from monsters this way, which is why hiding may have never been implemented. In May, however, good magic and evil magic, along with pray good and pray evil, were merged into just 2 regular skills, being magic and prayer. Next month, on June 11th, 2001, the island of Karamja and the fishing skill were finally released. Before fishing, players would have to use dough-based foods such as pizzas. PKers also finally had better food to eat in combat and no longer had to rely on skillers as much. A lot of players during this time stopped choosing the player killer account mode, however, because the cost of losing your items was way too high, and the number of players playing the game that could attack you just kept increasing. RuneScape already had 600,000 players registered by July of this year, so the Gower brothers knew that they needed a new system for keeping players' items safe, so they updated the banks around RuneScape to be able to carry all of your items instead of just your coins. 18 days later, on August 13, 2001, the Wilderness was released in the north for fighting, making PvP allowable everywhere, as well as the PKer account modes a thing of the past. To the Gower brothers' surprise, players were literally playing RuneScape for 10 to 15 hours a day. Level 99 was the maximum you could obtain in a skill, and just 8 months after the game's release on the 28th of August, a player called Everdread became the first player ever to achieve the very first level 99 in RuneScape, being the woodcutting skill, and he was even way ahead of everyone in the skill at this time. When the Gower brothers made level 99 the maximum level for stats, they never really imagined that anybody would ever attain that level in any skill. Next month in September, the Dragon Slayer quest was added, and with it, so was rune armor and weapons. Before runes existed, adamant armor and weaponry was actually the best in the game. On the 21st of October, Blue Rose 13X was the first to level 99 magic. The high scores began this month as well, in an early concept form. The initial concept of the high scores was to display the best player in a particular skill or profession on each server. On the 24th of November, the concept of the high score table was changed, showing player ranks overall, along with all of their stat levels and experience points, but would only record and display the top 2,000 players. The maximum number of stackable coins and items were finally updated during this month too, changing the new max number from 65.5k to 2.147 bill as we know it to be today. On the 13th of December, Blue Rose 13X was also, once again, the first to another level 99, which was smithing. At this time, she was the only player that could make full rune armor sets, and because of it, she could essentially charge however much she wanted to. Blue Rose 13X was eventually given, along with Rab and the others I mentioned in the year 2000, the secret moderator status as well. Rab, however, would resign from his secret moderator position at the end of this year due to the amount of stress that the job involved. This year became a very successful, yet stressful year for all three brothers. RuneScape launched at a very interesting time. It was just as the internet was becoming a big thing and the dot-com bubble era was beginning. The dot-com bubble, also known as the internet bubble, was a rapid rise in technology stock equity valuations fueled by investments in internet-based companies during the late 90s. In other words, RuneScape launched right when people really began using the internet and when people began investing in internet-based companies like Jagex at this time. All sorts of online multiplayer games were coming out, and it was exciting because before them, you'd have to be in a room with your friends if you wanted to play, say, Dungeons & Dragons. With broadband and dial-up internet becoming more popular everywhere, it also meant that RuneScape could be played in other places than just your personal home. You could play it at your school computer labs, public libraries, and anywhere else that had a public internet connection, which really helped RuneScape spread at first. Disaster would soon strike for Andrew, Paul, and Ian though, because purely internet-based companies like Jagex began losing over 70% of their valuations on the Financial Times Stock Exchange Index on the London Stock Exchange. Advertisers began pulling the plugs on internet-based companies and their websites. Jagex had lost their advertisement investors as well, and the ad revenue they had wasn't enough to keep the game running. It was literally costing Andrew Gower money to continue to keep the game online since membership didn't exist yet. Not wanting to shut it down for all the players' sakes and for all his hard work over the years, he decided to move back in with his parents in Nottingham, England to try and save money. There, Ian, Paul, and Andrew would set up a divider curtain in their parents' kitchen, and this area would serve as a makeshift office for them to continue working on the game. It was also during this year that Andrew was approached by a player named RS Guide, who said he wanted to purchase RuneScape from Jagex, but was later found out to be a fraud. Andrew stated that this player had begun asking him to send him money via Western Union transactions, and he became suspicious. Andrew had checked his website at the time and found out that RS Guide's website wasn't getting near as much traffic as he had led him to believe. They were eventually supposed to meet with lawyers as well, but Andrew also found out that RS Guide lied about even having a lawyer booked in a nearby hotel where they would have met. Andrew never sent RS Guide money or signed any contracts with him though, and the deal obviously fell through. RS Guide seemed legitimate at first though, so he was eventually given moderator status within the game, but this was later revoked. Ending this year on a high note though, RuneScape received their second holiday event on Christmas. The first holiday event took place back in October in this year. Edible pumpkins were spawned around the world for players to find. Christmas crackers were dropped around the game during Christmas though, and when used on another player, one of them would receive a different colored party hat that was inside. The crackers, party hats, and pumpkins were not worth much during this time though, and were mostly given away, eaten, lost, or sold to general stores around the game. But today in RuneScape 3, since not many of these items exist anymore from this time, those items are now worth billions, making them also worth thousands of real-life dollars. Stepping away from the business side of the game for now, let's talk about some player achievements during this year. A player named TKS was the first player ever to reach 99 cooking on January 8th of this year. She would also continue on to be the first player to level 99 fishing 4 months later on May 23rd. She was ranked 1 overall in the game at this time, actively competing against the Old Knight. A little unknown fact about TKS was that her username was an abbreviation of her real name Tina K, and in her spare time, she had a website where she tracked her weight loss journey through a low-carb diet. She also stated that she had only started playing RuneScape because of her kids, and she just wanted to be better than them, and she was. The Old Knight even admitted that he was only ever able to overtake the rank because she had eventually quit in the summer of 2003. Unfortunately, after the username cleanup in 2014, TKS lost her username to somebody else. The person who took her display name kindly campaigned on the RuneScape forums to have her name restored to the original account, but Jagex never fulfilled this request. Later, she reported that she could not see herself playing RuneScape without her original name, so she unfortunately quit for good. On April 5th, Cow Chicken was the first to 99 firemaking. On the 16th of May, Zhonghui was the first to 99 attack and level 123 combat, the max combat level at the time. In June, Lady Killjoy was the first to 99 strength. On the 3rd of August, Swede Mike was the first to 99 thieving. Next month in September, Joe Bill 64 was the first to level 99 mining. On the 17th of September, Snake Slava was the first to level 99 range, and those conclude all of the players to the first 99s within this year. Going back to February, at the beginning of this year, on the business-related end of RuneScape and Jagex, the Gower brothers had been working in their parents' kitchen for the last 6 months, and the game was still costing more to run than it was making in profit. 1 million players had been registered by February of this year, and Andrew knew something needed to change fast. The brothers began discussing putting paid membership into the game, but Andrew also knew that if he did this, Jagex would have to become a much more commercial operation, and that he wouldn't be able to just ignore customer support emails if he was taking players' money. Andrew wasn't very experienced in running a company to turn a profit, and he knew he needed staff to help him. That's when he remembered Constant Tedder, the CEO of GamesWire that had previously offered him a job 2 years ago in 1999. Constant Tedder agreed to work with Andrew and was named CEO of Jagex, a position he would keep until 2007. RuneScape needed around 3,000 membership subscribers to cover the server hosting costs. On the 27th of February, membership was fully installed, and it was confirmed by Paul Gower at RuneFest in 2010 that the first membership benefit was being able to log in anytime you wanted. Within the first few days, 5,000 players subscribed to membership, and the Gower brothers were blown away, and their game was saved. Membership also brought in new quests such as the Heroes Quest and Lost City, which in turn yielded players, for the first time ever, a Dragon Battle Axe and a Dragon Longsword. The Dragon Medium Helmet was also added this year, and later, most of the northeastern parts of the Kandaren region on the world map were released as well. Not stopping after his success though, Andrew rushed to further his company by posting an area on the Jagex website advertising that they were recruiting programmers and 2D and 3D graphics artists. He then went down to a conference and meeting center called St. John's Innovation Center, asking for an office to begin interviewing potential staff members. After receiving office for holding interviews, people began showing up the very next day due to their advertisements on the Jagex website. There was no furniture in the office though. The office was completely empty. Paul even said that he was setting up computers while Andrew was giving interviews, which probably was quite distracting. Andrew himself had no idea how to even interview someone and had to Google it. Mod Ian was the first Jagex moderator ever, being the 4th official Jagex moderator after the brothers themselves, and he is still working at Jagex today as an audio developer. He is the longest serving Jagex employee. He says that in his interview, at the time though, it was funny because all Andrew did was ask him to type something. When employees did start, their first task was to build and set up their own desks and computers, as the company didn't have any supplied themselves yet. By June of this year, Jagex consisted of 11 employees, and they would either move or update their offices frequently, sometimes even knocking holes in walls and just expanding from there. Holiday events would see a return to the game as well, and 5 more tradable rare items, all of which would come to be worth millions in the future, were released again. On Easter in April, just like Halloween last year, edible Easter eggs were dropped around the world this time for players to find, and later in October, red, blue, and green Halloween monster masks were dropped as well, and in December for Christmas, Santa hats were also dropped. In July, the character categories you could choose from when you originally started the game were eventually removed. On the 11th of September, the Report Abuse button was added to make customer support staff members' jobs easier. 2 weeks later, on the 24th of September, another members-only feature was added, being the King Black Dragon, RuneScape's first ever boss monster. On the same day, Tutorial Island was released for new players as well. At the end of the year, on the 12th of December, the Agility skill was released, and the Carpentry skill was removed. Carpentry had been put into the game this year on the stat menu, but wasn't trainable, yet it did have its own high scores table. It was supposed to be an early form of the construction skill that later released in 2006. Player-owned houses that were going to be associated with the skill were actually in RuneScape Classic at the time on the eastern sides of Falador and Varrock, but the areas were never accessible. The original idea was that these houses were going to be auctioned around amongst the player base, as there weren't enough houses to go around for everyone. Some would have to be homeless, just like in real life. Eventually, the idea was scrapped. Everything was running quite smoothly. Players were enjoying the game, and Jagex was really beginning to gain traction as a proper business, but the game wasn't without its faults, still being so young. A game-breaking bug known as the knife glitch was abused a lot by players. Today, in regular RuneScape, you can't equip knives, but during 2002 in RuneScape Classic, you could, and they gave you some attacking bonuses. When you're walking in RuneScape Classic, you won't drop an item until you stop walking. The glitch was done by dropping as many knives in your inventory as you could while you were wielding one before you stopped walking. The drop knives attack bonuses would transfer to the one wielded knife for some reason, allowing players to literally one-hit monsters and other players in the wilderness. To punish players for abusing this bug, Jagex made it to where players would die instantly if they logged into the wilderness wielding any knives. If you had any knives wielded outside of the wilderness, the knives in your inventory would simply just disappear. Another issue RuneScape began having was bots. To help combat them, a fatigue system was released into the game on the 13th of November. After performing a certain amount of actions in the game, your fatigue level would reach 100% and you would be forced to find a bed to sleep in before you could continue playing. Other than some bots, some bugs, some features that were removed, and the struggle at the beginning of the year for Jagex to get off the ground as a company, everything was going very well for RuneScape and Jagex. So the newest challenge for Jagex this year was customer support. Their business was taking off quite successfully, and at the beginning of this year, this was the main area that required their attention the most. Up until this point, everything was done by email. Any players that had any sort of issue would email Jagex at a specific email address. Needless to say, their emails were flooded in the hundreds of thousands. The problems players were having ranged from a player being stuck somewhere, losing items and simply wanting them back, wanting to report other players this way instead of using the report abuse button like they should have, wanting their accounts unbanned or unmuted, sometimes wrongfully so. Pure spam emails were sent sometimes, and many, many more illegitimate emails that sometimes got in the way of the legitimate ones. And some were even written by children that were just completely not understandable at all. They just wanted to say hi to a J-mod. This email system for dealing with their customers worked great at first when the game's population was smaller, but over time, absolutely anyone being able to email Jagex at any time proved to be somewhat of a nightmare for the staff, and Andrew was working hard to continue coding a system that might possibly help them sort player issues. Most of the Jagex employees weren't trained in dealing with customer support related issues, so they had to begin hiring people that had experience in this field. For example, in the beginning, there was no way to recover your password if you forgot it. There wasn't even a way for you to try and prove that you were the original owner of your account. Passwords couldn't even be reset because players simply just logged in with usernames at this time, and email addresses weren't associated with players' accounts like they are today. Back then, this feature just didn't exist on the website. Andrew and other programmers at Jagex ended up having to code 20 to 30 different automated systems that each had a different function in relation to handling, filtering, and responding to players' issues and reports that they'd send in by email or through the report abuse button. Eventually, after these automated systems were in function, Jagex could relax a little. The secret moderators I spoke of earlier in the years 2000 and 2001 were eventually demoted to regular players, as they were unneeded now due to Jagex acquiring over 50 employees at their business. The player Lightning was the last unofficial Jagex moderator to lose his privileges in the summer of this year. The players were still going strong, playing for insane amounts of hours daily. RuneScape now had 5 million registered players this year in October. On the 23rd of March, The Hate was the first player ever to achieve level 99 agility just 4 months after the skill's released last year. He was even suspected of botting at the time, but he was really just efficient and played 17 hours a day. 1 week later, on the 30th of March, the player LT Angel was the first to 99 crafting. She was light years ahead of everybody else in the skill, and the reason why was because she had crafted Dragonstone amulets for other players for free, since most didn't have high enough crafting at the time to do it themselves, making her being able to train crafting for free herself as well. 8 days later, on April 3rd, the player Chili Peppers became the first to achieve level 99 fletching. Another first 99 wasn't achieved until 2 months later on the 9th of June, when Halv Noon was the first player ever to reach level 99 Herblaw, known today as Herblore. Sadly, TKS's reign as rank 1 overall came to an end this summer in July when she finally quit, overturning the rank to a player Beware of Meef. His reign was short-lived though, as in September, he was overtaken by Bonebreaker 6, but he also quit as well, with a total level of 1,625 in December towards the end of the year. Then, the legend himself, Zezima, who began playing in July of 2001, took rank 1 overall for the first time. Having gotten better at dealing with customer support now, Jagex had begun making some changes to the game based on players' feedback. On the 11th of November, the official RuneScape forums was launched to the public, and Jagex began choosing players to become forum moderators to help with the forum's activity, though they did not have any moderator powers in-game. 2 weeks later, the fatigue system was reduced on the 25th of November due to a lot of player complaints. Last year, when you reached 100% fatigue, you would have to find a bed to rest in before doing anything else. There was no run option in RuneScape Classic, everyone walked at the same speed, so sometimes this could mean traveling great distances just to find a bed, so Jagex eventually ended up adding an item called the sleeping bag, in which you could click the rest option on it anywhere you were in the world, and you'd be brought to a menu where you'd have to enter a CAPTCHA code to begin playing again with 0% fatigue. This actually turned out to be an even better way of combating bots than the original fatigue system was before. Speaking of bots, there was a major bug abuse event this year that took place and it changed RuneScape's economy forever going forward. A Latvian RuneScape player by the name of Kiteninks would become the most famous bug abuser up until 2006. In Latvian, Kiteninks' name literally means pest or saboteur, one who engages in the act of sabotage. Kiteninks was a creator of a program called AutoRune. AutoRune was the very first scriptable RuneScape bot, and the scripting language was very easy to learn. It was a program that redirected the RuneScape client to AutoRune itself. It could do everything: auto-walk, auto-fight, auto-fish, auto-mine, and even PK other players. Kiteninks stated that he didn't remember when the first version of the program came out, but according to his internal relay chat client logs, him and another hacker were talking about advertising AutoRune's existence on other websites since 2002. Most people believe that Kiteninks' program led to the player 6 feet under duplicating holiday items. That's actually not the case. He never duplicated holiday items, he spawned them. On Kiteninks' old website, within the section of the site concerning his program AutoRune, he says, "On November 26, 2003, a player named 6 Feet Under discovered that it could be used for duplicating items. He was trying to trade one of the holiday items using AutoRune by giving server invalid parameters. Ironically, any item in the game could be duplicated except for holiday items and stackable items. So we were actually just spawning the holiday items, not duping them like everything else, as we didn't even need to own the item we wanted to create or spawn." During AutoRune's popularity peak during this year, thousands of players were using and abusing the program. Thousands of party hats were created, and the other items that were duplicated were worth billions in coins. Not all accounts that abused this bug were banned though. The main item dupers were banned, but some made quite a fortune and were never caught. The items were never deleted, and the game was never rolled back, Jagex stating that a rollback would have been an exaggeration. Kiteninks, along with AutoRune, were never heard from again after the year 2006. But his program that he created will always have an effect on RuneScape until RuneScape dies. He is the reason why tradable holiday items are the prices they are now today in RuneScape 3, some of which are being real-world traded for thousands of real-life dollars still to this day. Even as such a great issue, this bug was still solved by Jagex though in a matter of hours. They were on top of it right away. For the April Easter event this year, drops were actually untradeable, unlike their predecessors had been. Bunny ears were dropped around this time. 4 months later, on August 20th, RuneScape's 50th quest had been released, which was the Legends quest. The last update to the RuneScape 1 era would be the Halloween event in October of 2003, which almost didn't happen. In an update, Jagex asked players to vote in a poll before this holiday event would have been launched. They could choose between two options within this poll: delay RuneScape 2's development for a day and go ahead with creating the RuneScape Classic Halloween event, or they could have chose the other option to keep everyone at Jagex working on RuneScape 2, and there would have been a Pancake Day event in February next year instead, whatever that could have possibly meant. The poll ended with 78% of players choosing to delay RS2 so that the untradeable sites would still be dropped. 2 months later, however, when the Christmas holiday event was supposed to come out, Andrew wrote an update on the news list of the RuneScape website that read as follows. This is just a quick note just to say that there aren't going to be any RuneScape items dropped at Christmas. I really don't like having to say this, but I can't see any sensible alternative. This is because the last few drops actually caused a lot of upset and resulted in a huge number of complaints from players who didn't manage to get an item. Many players seem to get really upset about the drop, which is of course the exact opposite of the intended effect. Jagex slowly stopped updating RuneScape Classic after having received a little bit of breathing room once the company was running like a well-oiled machine. During this momentary downtime in the middle of this year, they began working on a whole new project. The technology of the world and the internet was changing. RuneScape, as everyone knew it, was about to receive a huge makeover. Andrew completely rewrote RuneScape's game engine and codebase and began fixing all sorts of things he didn't like about the original version of the game that had been out for the past few years. The scripting language was completely rewritten, and it was far more flexible. Basically, RuneScape was rewritten entirely from scratch. Nothing in the world would ever be 2D again. On December 1st, 2003, the official RuneScape 2 beta was put online for paying members to try out for the very first time. The players and Jagex were apprehensive at first. Jagex didn't know if players would take to this new shiny version of RuneScape. Jagex knew that some of their players' entire lives revolved around RuneScape every single day, and they were very mindful of that fact. So the old game RuneScape 1 now would be known as RuneScape Classic and would be kept online at the time, just in case. And this new version of RuneScape would be called RuneScape 2. When the beta launched, players had their RuneScape Classic stats copied over to this new version of the game, but their quest history and items were not copied over. You basically started out with nothing, except your stats you had gained in RSC. This was deliberate, as Jagex wanted players to test out all of the beta's content. Initially, only the free-to-play areas were available during the first phase of the beta from January to March, and the members' areas and members' quests that already existed in RuneScape Classic were being gradually released into the beta over this period of time. There was, needless to say, a lot of bugs. In the event that a player found themselves stuck somewhere, the Lumbridge teleport spell was purposely broken so that players could cast it without using runes to get themselves unstuck wherever they were. This was officially the first known home teleport spell. Eventually, after everything was mostly fixed, polished, and released, the second phase of the beta could begin. On March 3rd, 2004, Jagex once again copied over everybody's account files to RuneScape 2 from RuneScape Classic for the last time, including items and quest point histories now, along with fixing the previously intentionally broken Lumbridge teleport spell as well. Exactly 2 weeks later, on March 17th, the entire RuneScape 2 beta was no longer restricted to paying members only, and all free players now had access to it. This new shiny version of RuneScape was mostly well received by the community. There were some players that stuck with RuneScape Classic, but most people moved on to RuneScape 2. The game's mechanics had changed so much that made playing easier and more enjoyable. You no longer had to remain in combat until you and your opponent hit each other 3 times before you could eat or escape. You could do any of that whenever you wanted now. The combat triangle was implemented, so what you wore now had an effect on how successful you were when using melee, magic, or ranged combat. For example, you couldn't always cast spells successfully anymore if you were wearing full rune armor, which is something you could do in RuneScape Classic. PKing became more about skill instead of chance, and all the monsters were reworked to give you more experience when fighting them. The combat formula's experience points rates were reworked as well, which made the max combat level 126 instead of 123, like it was in the old version of the game. An example of this is when you started RuneScape Classic, you would have level 10 hit points because your starting XP for hit points was 1000. In RuneScape 2, when you start, your hit points would also be level 10, starting you with 1154 XP instead of 1000 within the skill. Players that never trained hit points at all in RuneScape Classic when they were transferred over still have level 9 hit points in RuneScape 2 to this day because of this. Only 3 players ever got to level 123 combat within RuneScape Classic. They were Gearshifter, Lil Yuffie 88, and Sax. The fatigue system was still on the stat menu when the beta first launched, along with sleeping bags too, but the sleeping bags couldn't be used and your fatigue would not rise at all when skilling. This was later done away with, removing the sleeping bags and fatigue as a whole, replacing them with random events instead to combat bots on this new game version, because the bots would surely start rolling in rather quickly. Banks could also now note your items. The inventory spaces were reduced from 30 to 28, Andrew thought it looked better. The equipment status menu was added alongside the inventory as well, making wielding items in your inventory a thing of the past, as they would now be wielded here instead. On the 25th of March, the Duel Arena was added, and players could now stake their items. On the 29th of March, the day the beta was officially named the main game, the rune crafting skill was also released, and with it, Zezma's reign as rank 1 from 2003 until now would come to an end due to the player Chopper Mad becoming rank 1 after this skill's release. Chopper Mad would hold rank 1 until level 73 rune crafting, because once Zezma officially began training the skill, in a matter of days, Zezma retook the rank from him. On May 17th, Lil Yuffie 88 became the first player ever to reach level 99 prayer. Next month, on the 14th of June, player moderators were added to the game, and 14 players were chosen to receive the status. Player moderators would now have silver crowns next to their usernames, and Jagex moderators would now have a gold crown next to theirs. Along with this update, Jagex released a section to the RuneScape website that normal players could not access, known as the Player Moderator Center, where PMods could contact JMods directly. July would become a big month for RuneScape 2. It was during this month that a series of hidden updates were released by Jagex that made the game look a bit more polished than it originally was after the beta had first launched. A lot of the vegetation around the game was changed over time. Item sprites received a massive overhaul, changing the way most items in your inventory and banks looked, and the entire game frame itself was updated to look a little less thicker than it originally was. The game frame wouldn't be updated again until 2007. It was also during this time in the month of July that Jagex signed a business deal with a third-party website called Miniclip. Miniclip was a popular website at this time that featured loads of Java-based and Flash player-styled games. RuneScape would be advertised on this website, and it tripled their player base very quickly because of this. Jagex's account creation system on the RuneScape website actually couldn't handle all the amounts of players that were trying to register, and the system eventually crashed. ModMark even stated that he could remember having a conversation with Andrew in which he almost decided to completely stop account creation for the time being at this time. On the 7th of September, the PVM community received a huge update, a brand new boss monster being the Calfight Queen, RuneScape's second ever boss. Along with the Calfight Queen's release, dragon chain bodies were also introduced into the game. They were worth millions and became one of the most sought-after pieces of equipment in the game at this time. 8 days later, on September 15th, Kale still became the first player ever to achieve level 99 runecrafting, just 6 months after the skill had been released. 12 days later, on the 27th of September, because of all the downtime Jagex had after being so successful recently, Ian Gower decided to create the X option on item menus. Up until this point, if you were going to withdraw from or deposit anything into your bank, you had to either withdraw or deposit 1, 5, 10, or all of whatever that item was. When it came to cooking food, you had to do it one by one, so this X option update from Ian was a very big quality of life update for the players. Only one holiday event happened this year due to the release of RuneScape 2, and it was the Christmas event. An NPC called Santa handed out yo-yos to everyone that talked to him in Varrock Square. To this day, it was the least thought out holiday event in RuneScape that ever existed. RuneScape's last major update of this year took place on the 13th of December, being Castle Wars, a player versus player capture the flag-like minigame in which 2 teams of players fought against each other as one player went for the other castle's flag and returned it to their base. It was a major hit with players and is still seen today as something very fun and nostalgic to do if you're ever bored in RuneScape. Going back to what I spoke of earlier, Jagex did have a lot of downtime during this year. The Gower Brothers company was so successful during this year, and their staff had grown in size. Because of this, Andrew and CEO Constant Tedder wanted to reward their staff somehow. Constant devised a foolproof idea, a jolly system in which the staff would be rewarded when certain business milestones would be hit, such as a certain number milestone of membership subscriptions they received from players. In short, the staff would have little mini vacations together as a group. They'd do things like drive speedboats, go go-karting, go paintballing, and a lot of other fun events were set up. Mod Cluffy recounts that at one point, 4 or 5 jollies would be stacked up on top of each other just because of the rate of speed that the company would be hitting these milestones. Multiple targets would be hit weekly, but when the jollies were written, they'd expect them to be months apart, not weeks. Andrew had even stated that some members of staff came up to him and said that they hadn't done a full 5-day week at Jagex since starting because of the amount of jollies being taken every week. 2004 was an all-around great year for RuneScape and Jagex, and for me. Shortly after the RuneScape 2 beta was released to free players, at 10 years old, I discovered this great game and created my account Moplox too. This year opened up with a simple, yet fun update. On January 5th of this year, the chat effects were added, such as glow, slide, wave, and flash. These chat effects are still heavily used to this day in OSRS and RS3. In the same month, on the 26th of January, the Slayer skill released. Prior to the Slayer skill, there wasn't much in the way of variety when it came to killing monsters around RuneScape during this time. This skill meant that players would now have to explore parts of the map they never had before, such as places like the desert and the Slayer Tower, when it came to killing these new monsters. On the 2nd of February, the Roving Elves quest was released, furthering the player's exploration of the Elflands to the west, and along with this quest's release, 2 new best-in-slot items were added, being the Crystal Bow and the Crystal Shield. 20 days later, Lumbridge and Draenor received graphical updates. Here's what Lumbridge used to look like, and this is what it changed into. Jagex wanted a more welcoming look in Lumbridge due to players starting their journeys here. Over near Draenor, the Wizard's Tower Bridge had been straightened. On March 22nd, the Easter event released. During the event, players were given a basket of eggs and would have to hand them out to other players. Their reward would be a rubber chicken that they could whack other players with. On April 4th, 2005, the Dragon Scimitar special attack was changed. Originally, the D-Skimmy special attack would drain other players' run energy completely when used on them. It was changed because it was obviously overpowered. Today, the Dragon Scimitar special attack removes your opponent's ability to use overhead prayers for 5 seconds. April would also come to be the month that the desert received a lot of content. Previously, there was really no need for players to venture out into the desert. The biggest piece of desert content that was added was the Desert Treasure quest on April 18. For the longest time, this quest was known as the hardest quest in RuneScape to complete. With the release of this quest, players received the Ancient Magic Spellbook, making PKing much more deadlier because of the spell Ice Barrage. But it was great for Elf Mage Kids Range and Imahama I PKing videos on YouTube. On May 9th, 2005, the Barrows minigame was released. Previously, the Combat Triangle's best-in-slot armor consisted of Rune and Dragon for melee, Black Dragon Hide for range, and Mystic Robes for magic. The Barrow's armor was seen as rare amongst players, and it was exciting when you saw somebody wearing a piece. At the end of this month, on May 31st, the female player models received an upgrade. Before this update, they basically used the same player model as males did, only, you know, they had boobs. They weren't very feminine looking in the slightest, and a lot of female players had requested this to be changed. On June 13th, the Runecrafting Abyss was released, making training the skill much easier when it came to traveling to the rune's specific altars. On July 9th, 2005, the legend himself Zezma achieved not only level 99 Slayer first before anybody, but with this 99 had also achieved a max skill total level of 1980, making him the first player ever to become maxed. On July 11th, the farming skill was released. Here's a picture that many people might have forgotten about or never knew about. This is what the login screen looked like when farming was released. This was the first time that the login screen itself had ever been changed since the release of RS2. On August 8th, 2003, RuneScape Classic officially closed. The only way you could play this version of RuneScape anymore during this time was that you had to have been an original RuneScape Classic player up until this point of its closure. On the 9th of September, the player 0xpx0 achieved level 99 farming first just 2 months after the skill had been out. 10 days later, on September 19th, bank pins were released, furthering account security if you happened to be hacked. On September 26th, Port Sarim, Remington, and some of Thurgo's area had all received graphical upgrades. These graphical upgrades mainly consisted of the Port Sarim docks and the surrounding trees and other vegetation within the regions being changed. It was also during this year that other areas in RuneScape received graphical upgrades as well. For example, Barbarian Village was changed into what it looks like today shortly before the year 2006. Around the same time, Falador also received an upgrade. It used to be gray instead of white. September 26th also brought a whole new look to the RuneScape website. It received a graphical layout similar to the way old school RuneScape's website looks today. On October 4th, 2005, the Czar Fight Caves released, and along with them, a brand new boss monster. That monster was Jad at a combat level of 702, and if you killed him after having survived 62 waves of other monsters, you received the brand new best-in-slot cape, being a fire cape. This was seen as a major achievement. Some players still can't kill Jad today. Before the Fire Cape's release, the Legends Cape was the best-in-slot cape. This month of October was quite a successful year for Jagex. Players were enjoying the game, loving the new content being put out by Jagex, and they received an investment from a business called Insight Venture Partners. Insight was a business that invested in other businesses similar to Jagex that developed online software, games, and other internet-based technology. The month of October ended with the release of the 2005 Halloween event that occurred on October 31st. During the event, non-aggressive zombies could have been found in Lumbridge Swamp. The zombies had an insult option. If you insulted them, the zombie would take off its head and throw it at the player. If the player caught the head, it would be theirs to keep. The zombie head could also be talked to or held up in the air as an item-triggered emote. Other zombies had a scare option. If you scared them, they'd break apart and put themselves back together, and it would scare you, the player, ultimately giving you the scared emote for the first time. This event also marked the first time ever that the Grim Reaper would visit players when they died in-game. The last update of the year 2005 was the Christmas event that began on December 19th. During the event, players could help Diego run his Christmas workshop, making decorations that would later
That's when I started playing the game.
Christmas tree in the center of Varrock. You could also find imps running around across RuneScape with decorations as well, and you could shake them to steal the imps' decorations. After decorating the tree, you would complete the event and be rewarded with different colored hats, scarves, and 3 marionette puppets. On the 1st of January this year, a player by the name of XXXNeoXXX7 was the first player ever to achieve 200 mil XP in a skill. That skill was fletching. On January 12th, over 5,000 RuneScape Classic accounts were banned by Jagex. RuneScape Classic wasn't being as monitored as closely as it once was due to RuneScape 2 becoming the main game version that people played. Because of this, bots were overwhelming RuneScape Classic, even though the game had already been closed to new players by this time. 1 week later, on the 19th of January, over 15,000 RuneScape 2 accounts were banned for macroing as well. These two instances of mass deletions of accounts marked the beginning of a long battle against bots that Jagex would have to take on during later years. On January 20th, the player Eve340 was the first player ever to reach 200 mil cooking XP. On January 22, 2006, Zezma achieved 500,000 XP overall, being the first player to ever do so. On the 20th of February, RuneScape received another boss monster that had a combat level of 305. That boss was the Chaos Elemental. Along with this boss monster's release, a new dragon weapon was added to the drop table, being the Dragon Two-Hander Sword, which was highly sought after and worth a lot of money during this time. The King Black Dragon's lair is found within the wilderness, but the KBD itself isn't actually in wilderness territory within its lair, so the release of the Chaos Elemental boss marks the first time players ever received a boss that could be found in the actual wilderness. On March 7th, the Giant Mole was released underneath Falador as well. On March 15th, Jagex added RuneScape's 100th quest, which was Recipe for Disaster, and for the first time, players received a new best-in-slot pair of melee gloves, being the Barrows gloves. Prior to the Barrows gloves release, the best melee gauntlets that you could obtain was the Steel gauntlets after the completion of the Family Crest quest. It was also during this month in March that the player The Old Knight had officially maxed his RuneScape Classic account, being the first RSC player to ever do so. Unfortunately, 1 month after this in April, he passed away due to colon cancer. In honor of his death and fame within the game, Jagex kindly placed this hill and grave in the wilderness. On April 10th, the forum moderators and Jagex moderators' posts on the forums became more distinguishable. On the same day, the 2005 Easter event had released. After completing the event, players received the item Easter Ring. When it was worn, it would turn the player into an Easter egg. 8 days later, on April 18th, the popular minigame Pest Control was released, along with Void Knight armor, which became to be popular transitions from Dragonhide or Barrows armor when it came to training melee, range, or magic. On April 27th, Jagex had announced that RuneScape had passed a new record, being that 197,000 players were all online at once. On May 31st, 2006, the construction skill was released. Before this skill, players had to wander around RuneScape with no real area that they could call their own. Player-owned houses was a very exciting update for the players, having been anticipated by them as far back as 2002. This update, of course, though, would bring on one of the most infamous bugs in RuneScape history. On June 6, 2006, otherwise known as 666, the player Cursed You achieved level 99 construction before anybody else due to the money he gained from staking in the Duel Arena. Because of this, he held a very public house party at the Remington House Portal on World 111. His house was huge, and being the first to 99 was far more progressed than any other player's house in the game. Due to the massive amounts of players inside his house, the lag became completely unbearable, and Cursed You was forced to kick all players from his house. Some players were partaking in combat-related activities inside the house though, and when they were kicked, they found out that they still had the ability to attack other players while being outside of the wilderness. Numerous players abused the bug, but only one level 115 player named Duriel321 took it a little further by ice barraging multiple people in Falador. What little footage that was filmed of this event focused on this player alone, and because of it, Duriel321 went down in history as the main abuser of the bug. Cursed You, the owner of the house, was later banned on August 25, 2006, 2 months later, for real-world trading. This event became known as the Falador Massacre, and became so infamous that Jagex has even stated that the events of this day were canon in RuneScape's actual historical lore, having taken place on the 14th of Pentember in the year 169 of the 5th Age. In RuneScape 3, there's even a memorial plaque of this in Falador Park, dedicated to all those that perished at the hands of Duriel. 5 days after the Falador Massacre took place, on June 11, 2006, the player Novalife officially passed Zezma and obtained rank 1 overall on the high scores after gaining level 99 construction on this day. He was also the first player ever to reach 2,178 total level, being maxed. On June 12th, the next day, the Warriors Guild was released. Next month, on the 4th of July, the Stronghold of Security was released. On August 29th, all giants, dragons, and demons received graphical upgrades and new sounds. This was the first time NPCs ever received any graphical upgrades since the launch of RuneScape 2, so this was a very controversial update amongst players at the time. I personally preferred the older sounds and models. On September 27th, the Lumbridge Home Teleport spell was released for new players that wanted to make their way back to Lumbridge if they got lost. On October 18th, skill capes were released. Up until this time, there was no way for players to show off their level 99s other than the high scores until these capes came out. These skill capes also came with specific emotes. The players that already had 99s got these capes immediately, and lower levels would follow them around asking mote blocks, meaning they wanted to see the skill cape emotes. This is where I got my username from. On October 30th, the 2006 Halloween event was released, and players that completed it got a skeleton costume and a pumpkin mask. On November 21st, RuneScape received its 23rd skill, being Hunter, my favorite skill. In the same update, the icons on the game frame and the snap menu were also updated. Less than 2 weeks later, the player Dark Forest 67 achieved level 99 Hunter first before anybody. This year ended with the 2006 Christmas event, in which players would receive a reindeer hat for completing it. The Gower brothers were worth around £32 million this year, and this year would have also been considered by many to be RuneScape's peak. This year would be the year that everything changed. RuneScape YouTube channels were becoming very popular, and more players began documenting the game's history as it unfolded. Jagex this year would become rank 59th in the Sunday Times article 100 Best Small Companies to Work For. On January 4th of this year, the Barbarian Assault minigame had released, giving players a new best-in-slot plate body other than Barrel's armor, which was the Finder torso. Exactly 1 month later, on February 4th, a 14-hour-long riot ensued in Falador on World 28. The riot occurred due to a popular RuneScape YouTuber and PKer Elfmage being muted. He was muted for luring other players into the wilderness to film his videos. 2 days later, on February 6th, the Fremenic Isles quest was released, placing the islands Nadisnot and Yatizo into the game, as well as giving players a new best-in-slot helmet, being the Nadisnot helmet. On Valentine's Day on February 14th, RuneScape released dedicated German servers. On March 20th, all chickens, cows, and rabbits had their graphical appearances upgraded. On April 18th, the Wilderness Ditch was released in attempts to stop players from luring each other. On May 1st, Jagex posted an update on the main page titled Bots and Real-World Trading. They began mentioning bots and real-world trading quite heavily during this time, listing off statistics for players to read about how many accounts they were actually banning each week. At one point in time, it was made clear that they were banning 8,000 accounts weekly for breaking these rules. On May 4th, RuneScape achieved a Guinness World Record for having reached 1 million membership subscriptions. On May 8th, small spiders, calphites, scorpions, and the metal dragons also received graphical upgrades. With graphical upgrades becoming the new norm, it was only fitting that eventually it carried over into RuneScape cities. On May 29, 2007, Varrock and all of its NPCs changed forever and received a massive graphical upgrade. This would be RuneScape's biggest makeover yet for any city for the first time. Because of this change, 4 days later on June 2nd, more riots occurred in World 64, 65, and 66, and it caused RuneScape's very first entire server blackout. On a lighter note, on June 13th of this month, Zezma became the first player ever to reach 1 billion total XP overall. On June 26th, RuneScape's game engine was updated and an entirely new game frame was implemented, being the main game frame that we all know today in old school RuneScape. On July 24th, Party Pete's room was officially moved to a more populated city, being Falador. Next month on August 6th, Clan Chat was released. Before Clan Chat, players' only way to communicate with each other was through private messaging, so this was actually seen as a pretty great update. 4 days later, on August 10th, Jagex saved a copy of this 2007 version of RuneScape and deleted any older version of the game forever. This is why Old School RuneScape's revision is the revision that it is. Old School RuneScape's revision, at the beginning, was a revision of August 10th, 2007. August 28th, the God Wars dungeon was released, bringing loads of new armor and weapons into the game. On the 18th of September, the ZMI altar was released. This boosted runecrafting's original max XP per hour rate from 25k to 50k. On October 2nd, another city received a major graphical upgrade, being Edgeville. On October 23, 2007, after being with Jagex for 5 years and implementing many great updates, Constant Tedder unfortunately resigned from being CEO at Jagex, and he was replaced by a man named Jeff Idison. On November 5th, the Assist system was released. This system allowed other players to give XP bonuses to their friends while they were training. On November 11th, the skills interface was upgraded again, and it went from this to this. On November 26th, the Grand Exchange was released northwest of Varrock West Bank. This was a massive change to the way trading was done in RuneScape. Player interaction was no longer needed, and merchanting clans became very popular very fast. A lot of players liked the GE, and a lot of players hated the GE. The update was extremely controversial. December unfortunately started off in a bad way, and it only got worse from there, for both players and for Jagex. Real-world trading and bots had only gotten worse. Sometimes it seemed as if bots had taken over entire cities. Bots at this point in time made up about 30% of RuneScape's player base. On the end of the illegal activities, gold farmers began stealing players' credit card numbers. They would then use these stolen credit card numbers to make RuneScape member accounts to farm gold on. Players quickly began realizing that their cards were being stolen and used. Banks began returning thousands of real-world dollars to players that had their private information stolen in this way, and it caused some serious problems for Jagex with real-life banks. The banks began thinking that Jagex was behind all this stolen money that was being refunded to people, and Jagex as a company almost wasn't allowed to be able to accept credit card payments anymore because of this. Paul Gower stated that if that had happened, they would have really been screwed as a business, because if there's no Jagex, there would be no RuneScape. In RuneScape's 15th year anniversary documentary, Andrew recounted these times, stating in his own words, "It got to the point where we were like, there's only two ways that we could possibly tackle this. We could either A, start selling the items ourselves, because that would basically dry up the gold farmers' markets and they would have no financial incentive to keep breaking our countermeasures, or we could do something really radical, which could completely break it, which is restricting trades." So, on the 12th of December 2007, Jagex had announced that they were going to make a decision that they didn't take lightly at all, and that they were going to begin adding a trade limit at the beginning of next year. On the same day of this announcement, the Wilderness received a massive update. The Wilderness Volcano, Bounty Hunter, and Clan Wars were put into the game. Along with this update, the Duel Arena, for the first time ever, was changed to free-to-play. Ending this year on a lighter note, though, the player who had originally achieved level 99 Herb Lore before anybody else back in 2003 finally achieved 200 mil XP overall in the skill before anyone else as well. The player was Half Noon, so it essentially took him 5 years to achieve this. On January 2nd of this year, trading and staking would never be the same again. They were now capped limited by the amount of quest points you had on your account. If you hadn't completed any of the quests, you could only trade and stake within a limit of 3,000 coins. If you had completed all the quests, your limit you could work within then was 25,000 coins. Merchanting was significantly harder, and gift giving became a thing of the past. It was also during this year of the month that, because of these controversial updates and the massive amount of hate that came with them, Jagex had to completely remove the rant section on the RuneScape forums. Shortly after this, they also removed the compliments section as well, because all the hate just spilled over into that forum too. On January 15th, the summoning skill was released, and along with it, another new version of RuneScape's game frame and stat menu. For the first time in RuneScape's history, the stat menu had received a scroll bar. Summoning would also unfortunately mark the day that the Zezima era came to an end in RuneScape. On Zezima's original YouTube channel, Zezima0213, he had posted a message that stated, "I have stopped playing RuneScape competitively because it's getting progressively easier over time. With it getting easier to train skills and gain XP, I've lost a sense of accomplishment and what I've worked hard to achieve since I started in 2001. If things will continue to get easier, it ruins the game for those of us who have been here since the beginning." 11 days later, on January 26th, the player Syzygy became the first ever maxed free-to-play account. On February 8th, the player Nakishlade achieved level 99 summoning first. After Zezima had left the high scores, players Green098, Yogasun, and King Duffy 1 battled it out for rank 1 overall, but it was later King Duffy 1 who obtained and kept the rank for a while until he was beaten by Gert Jars. March wasn't too bad of a month for 2008 though. On March 5th, Jagex released a new website with loads of games on it called FunOrb. The two most popular games on the website at the time would come to be Arcanists and Armies of Gielinor. A lot of players actually switched from RuneScape to this website to play these games because they were so fun. Man, I miss Arcanists. On April 9th, the Fist of Guthix minigame was released. On May 8th, Jagex posted an update on the RuneScape's homepage titled, "An Image of the Future." This news post would mark the beginning of many more to come within the next few months, depicting a brand new version of RuneScape in which it featured high-detailed graphics. This was huge and pretty exciting, and the community had loads of questions. Not everybody was pleased, but players who supported and didn't support this update alike were filled with much anticipation in its release regardless. This would become one of the biggest updates in RuneScape's history. Furthering the sad times of a lot of things coming to an end in RuneScape, Ashley Miller, otherwise known as Fat Wrecked, a very popular RuneScape video maker at this time, unfortunately passed away due to heart failure. In this same month, on May 21st, Quick Chat was released, giving permanently muted players a way to finally speak to other players around them, other than using emotes as they had previously. On July 1st, a members-only beta launch of RuneScape HD had finally gone live. RuneScape also received major graphical changes among a lot of cities because of this. On July 14th, RuneScape HD had fully been released to all players. On the same day of RSHD's launch, the tutorial island was removed and it was replaced by a new tutorial called Learning the Ropes that was featured on the quest menu. Players didn't really take to this new tutorial, however, and they missed Tutorial Island since it had been in the game since RuneScape Classic. Because of this, a few months later, Learning the Ropes was removed and Tutorial Island was put back into the game. Also on the same day of these updates, the item lending system had been put into the game for players that were still upset about the trade restrictions. On August 22nd, Jagex had achieved another Guinness World Record, being given the title Most Popular MMORPG. On September 15th, the Corporal Beast boss monster was released, and along with it, its sigils and its shields. The Divine Spirit Shield was actually worth 1 billion gold when it first released, making it the first item ever to be just as expensive as rare holiday items. On October 15th, PvP Worlds were released in an effort to bring PKing back to life since the removal of the wilderness early in the year. On November 11th, the very popular Stealing Creation minigame was released. On November 26th, RuneScape received its first Grandmaster quest ever, being Wild Gothic Sleeps. With the release of this quest, Dragon Plate Bodies and Dragon Claws were released into the game as well. Dragon Claws changed PKing a lot, especially when it came to rushing other players, and the Dragon Plate Body was highly sought after when it released due to having been anticipated ever since the Dragon Chain Body came out in 2004. On December 11th, RuneScape released French servers. You can now play RuneScape on English, German, and French worlds. Something didn't quite seem right about Jagex this year amongst the players. For the first time in RuneScape history, RuneScape was facing an issue that it had never faced before: a decline in its player base. There were exactly 15 updates throughout this whole year that had to do with payment options and updates on how you could pay Jagex for membership subscriptions. It seemed as if Jagex was very much mainly about their money and profits this year on the news feed to a lot of players, something they hadn't been all about in the years before, or if they were, they hadn't been so public about it at least, like they were during all of 2008. In fact, the very last update of this year on December 19th was Jagex announcing that you could now pay for membership on FunOrb and RuneScape via SMS. The year 2009 started off with RuneScape's logout timer being changed from 90 seconds to 5 minutes on January 13th. On January 27th, an update was released that allowed players to filter their magic spells and teleports. On February 9th, another update was posted by Jagex titled The Future of RuneScape. Within this update, it was explained that Jeff Edison was resigning as Jagex's CEO and that he was being replaced by a man named Mark Gerhard, otherwise known as Mod MMG. An interview was later published after Edison's departure in which MMG gave his speculation as to just why he resigned. The quote by Mark was as follows: "The problem was, a year or so ago, there was, let me say confusion, a subtle word, as to what part of the business was important. I expect Jeff's focus was just sort of on profit and loss columns, and all of the attention was sort of on members, and members conversations, and getting free players to convert to members by putting membership hooks into the free game. Unfortunately, that had a really negative effect on the community, as you've taken what was an epic entirely free game and turned it into a sort of a demo for the members game, which was never the idea. So, unfortunately, we had a year where we did that. One of my first orders of business in February was ripping that part out. There are various things we did to monetize free players, such as serving long-standing free players video advertisements, something like 10 or 15 seconds long, which, whilst profitable, was simply wrong. Not in the spirit of the free game. Absolutely wrong. Mark Gerhard knew that RuneScape had been out of touch with its community most of 2008, and he began to attempt to reintroduce transparency between the business of Jagex and its player base. Jagex began using social media, specifically Twitter and YouTube at this time, as a platform to communicate with their players once again because of Mark's proposed changes. On February 10th, the Soul Wars minigame was released. 4 days later, on February 14th, and quite fitting for Valentine's Day I might add, the player Lover Romeo achieved 200 mil XP in agility and mining at the same time, being the first player ever to do so in both skills. On February 16th, an update was posted on the main page in which Mod MMG would host a Q&A and answer some players' general questions about himself as the new acting CEO, as players didn't want a repeat of 2008. It was during this time that, when asked if he even played the game at all, he answered that he currently had 90 quest points and a total level of 892 on an account. In fact, much of 2009 would consist of numerous Q&As with MMG, furthering his mission of bringing back transparency and a connection between Jagex and the players. On March 31st, most likely due to this same mission for transparency, the rants section and the compliments section of the RuneScape forums was officially re-added. Speaking of forum updates, the RuneScape forums was opened up to free players for the first time ever, and this would become permanent. If you were a free player that had 12.5 mil XP on your account, you could now access the forums. On May 6th, wilderness-only PvP worlds were released in RuneScape as well. The original PvP worlds would allow you to attack anybody you wanted all over Gielinor. However, in these worlds, the fighting would only be restricted to the wilderness, giving players back a sense of the wilderness being dangerous as it was up until the end of 2007. On June 9th, the rest feature was added to RuneScape alongside the Run Energy orb next to the minimap. There was also musicians put in place around the world that the player could sit down and rest at that would restore their Run Energy also, but much faster than just resting on their own. On July 24th, RuneScape servers were released in their 4th language ever, which was Brazilian Portuguese. On August 11, 2009, Jagex had partnered up with Machinima from YouTube and they held a video making competition. On the 25th of August, the competition was over and a popular YouTuber at the time named Excel had won the competition. Excel had already been partnered with Machinima and had made hundreds of videos for them already. So, his idea for the competition was to actually make a comical video of him trying to come up with an idea for the actual competition. For winning, he received lifetime membership, as well as a paid way-and-stay trip to the UK to hang out at and tour Jagex Studios. He was accompanied by his good friend, another famous YouTuber named Cameron at the time, otherwise known as TNoobShow. On September 7th, a player by the name of Unknown Levs became the first level 3 account to achieve level 99 Slayer, which he was able to do through the Soul Wars minigame. 10 days later, on September 17th, Tutorial Island was once again removed and replaced by a brand new tutorial called Unstable Foundations. It was essentially a remake of the previous Learning the Ropes tutorial, only this time, it was actually voice acted by Jagex employees, being RuneScape's first piece of voice acted content. On September 23rd, living rock caverns were released in RuneScape and a specific rock was taken out of the desert mining quarry simultaneously. The quarry had been the best XP per hour until this rock was taken out, forcing living rock caverns to become the best mining XP per hour during this year, making it quite clear that RuneScape was beginning to enter the age of social-based skilling. On October 1st, display names were released. This meant you still logged in with your original RuneScape username from when you created your account, however your in-game name could be changed to whatever you wanted it to be, furthering account security when it came to players being hacked. Unfortunately though, this update caused the beginning of a RuneScape username trading black market for rare usernames. On November 18th, the RuneScape forum avatars and the Adventurer's log was released on the RuneScape website that displayed your most recent achievements. You could navigate to any player's Adventurer log by searching them on the high scores or by clicking on their new forum profile avatars. On November 25th, RuneScape Classic was reopened for a short amount of time for paying members. Even though the year might have started out a little rocky in some areas, many players considered 2009 to be a really good, nostalgic year to have played RuneScape or to have started RuneScape. Jagex received a number of awards this year as well. They were listed in the Deloitte Technology Fast 50, a program that recognizes and profiles the fastest growing public or private technology companies within Central Europe. And it was because of this systematic profiling that Jagex had received the Best Company One to Watch award. They also were ranked 29th most successful game studio in the world by Develop Magazine. They were given the Best Desktop Game Project Award at the Duke's Choice Awards and also won Developer of the Year at the Golden Joysticks Awards. On the 23rd of January in 2010, a strange event began happening on every single RuneScape game world. Every single player in RuneScape at the same time was forced to perform an emote called the Strange Power. When this event happened to you, you'd receive a message in your chat box that said, "You feel a strange power unleash itself upon you." After the emote would end, players' characters would be forced to face the north towards the wilderness, and nobody could figure out why. Many players had took to the forums and began writing their theories and conspiracies. On February 1st, the trading restrictions had received an update as well. Previously, you were limited by the amount of quest points you had. That didn't go away, but you could now trade more items or gold to your friends based on how long your friendship had existed in months. For example, if you had been friends with a player for 2 months, your trade limit between each other would be doubled. If you were friends for 3 months, it would be tripled, and so on and so on. On February 22nd, Diamondheim was released into the game, and it gave players a little bit of an explanation as to what that strange power emote was all about. Originally, players thought that they were being forced to face the wilderness after the emote had ended, but it was later understood upon Diamondheim's release that this area was the true direction they'd be facing at the end of the emote. Diamondheim wasn't accessible when it was released, but it became clear to everyone that this strange event was happening, all in the name of a new skill that would soon come to RuneScape. On February 26th, Jagex announced a prize draw called the Big Ticket. If you had previously won any competition that Jagex had hosted, such as their last Machinima video competition, you could now have a chance of winning this Big Ticket competition as well. If you won the Big Ticket, you would get to travel to Jagex again and win a lot of other prizes along with that. There were meant to be 24 players win this Big Ticket thing, however the competition was later scrapped without any explanation as to why, and only 3 players ever won it. March 3rd of this year brought a number of updates. The RuneScape login screen where players would originally click here to play was done away with, and a new lobby system was put in its place. When you logged into the lobby, before you entered the game, you'd be able to join clan chats, see which of your friends were online, and you'd be able to chat with them there as well. On the same day of this update, the hit point skill was renamed to Constitution. Your hit points, now known as life points, were multiplied by 10. If you had 75 HP, you now had 750 LP. Players' hit splats were also multiplied by 10 as well. If your max hit was originally 25, it would now be 250. Jagex made this change to signify that when players had originally hit zeros, they wouldn't actually be hitting zeros in the system. They'd just be hitting less than a 1, but not exactly 0, and they wanted to show that fact to everyone better. This change was not mentioned before it was released though, and major riots ensued because of Jagex being so vague before and after its release. This was seen as a massive update to the players, and a lot of them were not happy about this change. 10 days later after this, on March 13th, the first bonus XP weekend had officially launched, giving players a 2.7 times bonus when skilling on the weekends. Players were extremely apprehensive about this update at first, thinking that this would surely break any sense of achievement amongst the player base, but it actually turned out to be a massive success of an update, and bonus XP weekend still occurs on select weekends in RuneScape 3 to this day. On April 1st, Jagex released a news post along with a cartoonish-looking map that was called Wet and Wildy, and it was described in this news post that Jagex was going to open a RuneScape theme amusement park in the future. This was obviously an April Fool's joke, but a lot of children at the time were quite upset when they found out that this was unfortunately fake, including me at the time. Jagex, a RuneScape amusement park would have been pretty freaking cool, man. On April 11th, Gurjars became the first player ever to achieve 2 billion XP overall. The next day, on April 12th, the Dungeoneering skill was released, and it was the first skill in RuneScape that players could level to 120. Because of this, Gurjars quit the game. On April 14th, 2010, something went wrong in the Dungeoneering skill, and it led to a bug that allowed players to reach absurd runecrafting XP per hour rates inside of the dungeons. This was fixed immediately, and for the first time ever, the RuneScape servers were rolled back. On May 7th, the player Skiller703 achieved level 99 Dungeoneering before anybody else had. Skiller703 was rank 1 overall at this point in time with 1.2 billion XP overall, but was later passed as many players gained Dungeoneering levels over 99. On May 25th, RuneScape launched their first ever downloadable client. You can now play RuneScape from your desktop instead of having to play it in an internet browser. On the 12th of June, an unknown update caused climbing boots to skyrocket to a price of 75k. Before this, they had been worth a few hundred coins. Some players had figured out that this change was apparently going to be happening before it did though, and climbing boots were purchased in the hundreds of thousands, creating billionaires overnight after the update released. This was never fixed, barely addressed, and caused major rioting within Falador on World 66 as well. On June 15th, Jagex released Ancient Effigies into the game. You could use these items to gain massive amounts of XP. With their releases, players could no longer tell the differences between efficient skilling and the use of Ancient Effigies, and this affected skilling competitions at the time very negatively amongst the community. Because of this update, the assist system also had to be shut down and done away with. On August 22nd, the player Telmo Marcuse became the first player ever to achieve level 120 Dungeoneering, thus making him the new rank 1 overall player. On August 28th, the very first RuneFest was held in London in the United Kingdom. It was a way for Jagex to reconnect with their players in the real world and online, as they would also stream the entire event. This being Jagex's first public event, however, the entire staff was a bit nervous that it might not have met event-goers' expectations, and because of this, they actually refunded every person's ticket that attended RuneFest in 2010. This RuneFest was a massive success though. In hindsight, ticket refunds definitely did not need to happen. RuneFest would go on as a traditional event in the real world each year that Jagex would hold in the UK, and it's still to this day an event that is very looked forward to by many. On October 18th, loads of new game sounds were being put into the game for both players' reactions and monsters' reactions. Instead of a small grunt your player would usually do when you were injured, your player actually screamed now. October ended this month with Jagex, once again for the second year in a row, receiving the title of Best Developer at the Golden Joysticks Awards on the 29th. On November 24, 2010, the way RuneScape players logged into the game was changed in an attempt to further account security. Previously, you had to log in with your username, but for players that registered past 2010, they would now be given the option to log in with an email address instead of a username. On December 21st, after 3 long years, Jagex released a poll on the front page of their website titled Wilderness and Free Trade. It was a poll that allowed players to vote on whether or not they wanted the wilderness to be brought back and the trading and staking limits to be removed. There was no no option on this poll, however, and the votes were not verified, meaning that people quickly began spamming the vote counter over and over. Due to this first poorly executed poll, Jagex released the same poll once again 3 days later on December 24th with the proper vote spammer precautions in place, and this time the poll actually did have a no option. Jagex stated that the poll prior to this one did not have a no option before because if players didn't want the wilderness and free trade to return, all they had to do was simply not vote. It was also during this month, in December, that Andrew Gower had been put under a lot of stress since he had first created RuneScape back in 2001. Things were changing, and he was unhappy with these changes, and more so, having to be responsible for them. He would later say in RuneScape's 15th year anniversary documentary the following: "I suddenly realized whilst I wasn't in charge, all of a sudden, what I had to say didn't matter so much. People would be doing things not the way I wanted them to do them. That was the whole point, of course. I didn't want to be responsible. I just wanted to be able to advise and help and nurture the game I had made without having to be so responsible. But as soon as that responsibility was taken away, I realized, oh dear, you can't have it both ways. Without the responsibility, you can't have the authority. You can't have one without the other. And by trying to make myself less stressed and reduce the responsibility, I had also reduced the authority. And I made a mistake, quite frankly. It eventually reached the point where I wasn't doing anything for Jagex anymore, and there was no sort of date when I left either. It was just something that sort of faded away." Andrew had finally sold his stakes in Jagex and left the board of directors at the end of 2010. Mod Mark in later years would state that he never got the chance to hug him and just say thanks for everything. January opened up this year with Jagex celebrating RuneScape's 10-year anniversary. Because of this, the company actually gave out $10,000 to one lucky player every single month of the year because of this anniversary. On January 10th, RuneScape received the next boss, being the first monster ever in RuneScape with a combat level of 1000. On January 14th, the voting for the Wilderness and Free Trade to Return poll was closed, and 3 days later on January 17th, Jagex had confirmed in a news post that they would both definitely be brought back. The poll ended with almost 1.2 million players voting yes, making up 91% of the poll compared to the other players that voted no for the change. On February 1st, 2011, the Wilderness and Free Trade had officially been re-implemented into the game and Bounty Hunter Worlds were removed. Unfortunately, many players had left because of the Wilderness and the Free Trade update at the beginning of 2008. Here's what RuneScape looked like in 2008. Here's what RuneScape looked like in 2011. I myself attempted to return to the game in 2011 after I had quit in 2009, but when I came back, even though the Wilderness and the Free Trading was back, everything else still seemed, now more than ever, unrecognizable. I myself wouldn't return to RuneScape again until 2014 after hearing about the release of Old School RuneScape 1 year after it had already been out. This case of mine, unfortunately for Jagex at the time, would be the cases of many throughout these years. Even though they brought the Wilderness and Free Trading back in 2011, RuneScape as a whole since 2008 had changed drastically. On April 12th this year, Clan Chat was renamed to Friends Chat, and a more proper version of Clan Chat was put into the game for actual clans. On April 21st, Jagex won the Queen's Award for Enterprise within the Innovation category. On May 3rd, the Capes of Distinction were released. The player Castle Wars would be the first player ever to obtain a completionist cape just 20 minutes after the update had released. Castle Wars had helped Jagex with the requirement suggestions for this update, and because of this, he and he alone would be the only one with a completionist cape for about 3 months after they were brought into the game. On the 28th of June, the Loyalty program released. This was a shop that was introduced into the game world that you could visit and purchase items and auras for your player based off of how long you had recurring membership status. Some of these auras did things like making your player deliver the last killing blow to a monster 100% of the time. Though a very small thing, it did mark the beginning for a little glimpse into the future of RuneScape, as the game would soon start leaning towards a pay-to-win style. On July 26th, Clan Citadels were released. On August 6th, some bug abusers had actually obtained the Rotten Potato by pickpocketing Mod Crisso within the Stealing Creations minigame. This marks the first time ever that a non-Jmon player had a Jmon item in their inventory. On August 18th, the Refer a Friend system was introduced by Jagex. If you referred a friend, and your friend achieved a certain level status within the game after playing for a bit, you, as the referrer, would receive a 10% XP boost for 1 week. Players were limited to 5 refers per year. September marked the month where the Suwami era would begin in RuneScape, as he would climb to rank 1 overall and hold it for quite some time. Suwami's actually a good friend of mine, and on a personal side note here, I do miss him, as he hasn't played the game in a very long time. On October 4th, RuneScape received a small, yet sort of big update. The camera controls were no longer limited by your arrow keys as they had been ever since RuneScape's creation. You could now use your middle mouse wheel when controlling the camera instead. October 25th, 2011 became known as Bot Nuke Day. Jagex had released a program into the game that they called Cluster Flutterer. This banned over 7 million of illegitimate accounts in one night. Unfortunately, apart from all the positive sides of this update, there was one negative factor. A third of RuneScape's player base had vanished. Bots had literally made up about 35% of RuneScape's player base at this time, and a lot of young players couldn't understand this. To them, it just seemed like RuneScape was becoming less popular or that the game was dying. Neither was really too much the case, it's just that 98% of all bots in RuneScape had just been wiped out completely overnight. On November 11th, RuneScape received its very first fully voice-acted quest, being One Piercing Note. On November 22nd, an update on the main website was posted called RuneScape Revolution. Within this update, RuneScape received another game frame change, more particle and graphics reworks, and to top it all off, the high scores was permanently removed for free players. This meant that free-to-play competitive skilling would become a thing of the past. On December 6th, the Tool Belt and Muddy Pouch was released in RuneScape as well. You no longer had to have your money in your inventory. You could keep it in a little pouch near the minimap, and the Tool Belt would hold a variety of tools such as spades, hammers, tinderboxes, and so on. You would never again need any of these tools when training the skills that they were associated with if you had placed them in your Tool Belt menu. During this year, Jagex had reached over 500 employees at their company. It was also during this year that Inside Venture Partners had increased their stake in Jagex. They increased it from 35% to 55%, giving it a controlling factor in the company's decisions from here on out. On January 4th of this year, all Barrow's armor had received a graphical upgrade. On January 10th, RuneScape received the Best Browser Game Award and the Game of the Year Award on Massively.com. On February 14th, the Czar City, along with all of its inhabitant NPCs, received a major graphical upgrade, which at the time I thought looked awesome. Funnily enough, because of this update though, players had to relearn Jad all over again because he had received new animations. On February 28th, the Squill of Fortune released, marking the beginning of microtransactions being put into RuneScape. On March 6th, all player armor received a massive graphical rework. For example, melee armor went from this to this. On March 13th, lodestones were put into places all around Gielinor. Players could use these lodestones to teleport to any city they wanted to at any time. 2012's April Fool event was a really funny one. Jagex had posted that they were giving out green pea hats in Lumbridge. If you went to Lumbridge, it wasn't exactly a green party hat you received like most people were hoping for, however. Instead, it was literally just an actual pea that you could put on your head. In the same April Fool's update, Jagex also released a very hilarious video where they showed off what they called at the time Jag Motion, an exciting new way to play RuneScape in virtual reality. April 2nd was the day that microtransactions officially made their way into RuneScape. The Squill of Fortune had already been out since February, but you couldn't buy spins up until now. Up until now, it seemed like an innocent update. You could now buy these spins with real-world money, or you could get them from a ticket from monster drops. Essentially, children began gambling on this game. This caused major riots, like RuneScape had never seen before. The wilderness and free trade had just been brought back, and the whole removal of it in the first place in 2008 was because of real-world trading. So Jagex seemed extremely hypocritical amongst players for releasing this update. In fact, even some Jagex moderators were not happy about this update. To many, with the introductions of microtransactions, RuneScape became just like every other game out there and was considered no longer special. Shortly after this update, Paul Gower resigned, as he had promised that RuneScape would never receive microtransactions as far back as 2003. 22 days later, on April 24th, free players and members could receive even more spins on the Squill of Fortune by completing quests. On April 30th, 2012, the Rune Span was released, a whole new plane of existence in which players could train runecrafting. This update skyrocketed runecrafting's XP per hour rates, and because of it, having 99 runecrafting at this time became one of the least popular achievements, something completely unheard of before this update released. On May 4th, ModMark Gerhard released an update on the game's website calling the Squill of Fortune a massive success despite all the hate. He even said it was one of RuneScape's most appreciated updates since the beginning of RuneScape's existence due to 90% of the player base engaging with the wheel. Yeah, it was probably a success because children became addicted to gambling their real-world money away. On May 10th, firemaking was completely changed. Instead of lighting logs in a straight line like everyone had before, players would now create bonfires in which other players could throw logs on other players' fires, receiving firemaking XP. When you used another player's bonfire, you were also given a slight bonus and boost in your XP rate for the skill as well. The game was completely changing, and RuneScape's biggest update ever began development. On May 18th, 2012, the Evolution of Combat beta sign-up period was released for paying members of the game to apply for. On May 22nd, the Queen Black Dragon boss released with a combat level of 900. On May 28th, a single update was released titled Squill of Fortune, Win More, Win Big. Jagex had announced that it was now even more possible for players to win bigger prizes when spinning the wheel. For example, the 200 mil cash stack on the wheel had been changed to 500 mil, and you had a 10 times better chance of winning it. On June 4th, the Squill of Fortune was changed to the Squill of Neptune, featuring more aquatic items. You can now obtain a rare category item called a fish mask that blew bubbles on the wheel, and it was also tradable, yet somehow today isn't really rare at all, even though it's a discontinued item. I guess it just goes to show that if the player base doesn't like something strong enough, even intended rares simply just won't become rare with time. This fish mask was the first rare item that had been introduced to the game ever since Santa hats released in December of 2002. 10 days later, on June 14th, Jagex announced that the Squill of Fortune spins were on sale for 50% off, and if you bought them, you'd also receive 50% more bonus spins when spinning the wheel because of it. On June 26th, the Evolution of Combat beta had officially launched for the applicants that had signed up to try it. 50,000 players were accepted for this. On July 1st, 2012, the Squill of Fortune's wheel was replaced with nothing but XP lamps for 1 week. During this week, XP rates of players skyrocketed based off of how wealthy they were in the real world, furthering the pay-to-win concept the game decided to take on. On July 17th, the Solomon's General Store was released, along with rune coins. You could buy rune coins off of the RuneScape website with real-world money and use those rune coins to purchase cosmetic items from the newly released Solomon's General Store, furthering the company's decisions with microtransactions. On July 19th, Jagex had announced that RuneScape had received over 200 million accounts registered on their game. On August 10th, even more skins were added to the Solomon's General Store for players' shields and weapons. 4 days later, on August 14th, it was announced that Jagex had once again doubled the amount of cash on the Squill of Fortune. On August 29th, another news update was posted where ModMMG once again called the Squill of Fortune, as well as this time the Solomon's General Store, massive successes despite even more hate. On September 9th of this year, Gielinor was being changed heavily in preparation for the release of the Evolution of Combat. A lot of landscapes at this time were having their graphical appearances upgraded. On September 26th, Botany Bay was released. This put an area in the game where all botters would go if they were caught cheating in-game. Players could visit Botany Bay and make fun of them when they had been captured. It was a funny little update, and the technology and programming behind this new botting detection software was actually developed by former botting website owner Jack Mob, who was later given a job at Jagex by Mark Gerhard because of his programming skills. On the 9th of October, the King Black Dragon, RuneScape's first ever boss monster, finally received its own graphical upgrade. The rest of October's updates this year were all about the School of Fortune and the Solomon's General Store. On November 9th, Jagex released a poll in which players gave their feedback about the evolution of combat coming to RuneScape. Here were the results. 11 days later, on November 20th, the biggest, most controversial, community-splitting update in RuneScape's evolutionary history, the Evolution of Combat, was released across all RuneScape servers. During this year, Jagex's turnover as a business rose almost £50 million, most likely due to the School of Fortune and the Solomon's General Store. On January 23rd of this year, an update was posted on the main news feed in which ModMMG finally agreed with the community about the School of Fortune and the Solomon's General Store, admitting that most of 2012's update feed was dominated by the two microtransaction shops. The next day, on January 24th, RuneScape player So Wrecked made a video on YouTube challenging Jagex to release an older version of RuneScape. He created a petition for this change on change.org, and 44,770 people had signed it. Previously, in 2012, a private server was created called 2006scape, but it was shut down by Jagex on January 2nd of this year after having 500,000 players registered on it. The community's passion for the older game version became very clear to Jagex. On February 1st, Mod Mark released a forum thread talking about the passion for the developers and the players alike that all took part in 2006scape. He even asked Andrew Gower at this time what he thought about bringing an older version of the game back, and Andrew immediately agreed that this would be a good move for Jagex. However, most JMods estimated that old school RuneScape's lifespan would only be about 6 months before it would have to be shut down. Wrong. So, 12 days later, a huge advertisement for a poll was displayed on the main website that read, "Old School RuneScape, you vote." Within this poll, there were a number of milestones that could be met in correspondence with the vote count. The voting ended with a total number of 449,351 votes. Due to players' votes almost reaching a specific milestone, Old School RuneScape received a proper development team that would update the game consistently, and the first 6 months of Old School RuneScape membership would be absolutely free for everyone. It was Mod Philip who found an old hard drive that contained the August 10th, 2007 revision of RuneScape in the back of a safe at Jagex headquarters. On February 22nd, 2013, Old School RuneScape was officially released to the public. Just 5 days later, OSRS player Adtrait was the first player ever to achieve a level 99 in OSRS, being the thieving skill. On March 1st, the player Vongola achieved level 99 cooking first as well. Over in the other version of RuneScape, a new era began in the game as the quest The World Wakes was released, marking the beginning of the 6th age within the game version's lore, meaning that all other quests prior to this one had taken place in the past within the 5th age. That's actually really interesting and cool to me. On March 18th, Suwami would become the first player ever to reach 5 billion total XP overall, making him also the first player to have ever gained 200 million XP in every single stat. On March 29th, the HTML5 beta of RuneScape was announced. This HTML5 client was, at one point in time, thought to be by Jagex the future of browser gaming. With this massive client change soon to be happening to RuneScape 2, Jagex decided to begin officially calling this game version RuneScape 3. On April 17th, the RuneScape 3 beta program was released for players to sign up and try out the new graphics associated with the HTML5 client. On April 24th, RuneScape 3 received an update in which the game frame could be edited around your game screen, much like customizable HUDs on other video games. Along with this update, a massive overhaul and rework of RuneScape 3's songs were done by an actual orchestra. They had previously been done by a synthesizer. As an example of this, here's what the song Harmony now sounded like compared to its older version. From April to July within RuneScape 3, most of their updates were about the HTML5 beta program, the Squill of Fortune, and the Solomon's General Store, along with a brand new website makeover. It was also during these months that localized moderators were reinstated on the forums as community managers for the other non-English RuneScape 3 servers. On August 16, 2013, the player So Wrecked that originally created the petition for Old School RuneScape was hired at Jagex. 2 days later though, on August 18th, he would be fired before he could even start the job, due to a video leaking of him saying that he, as a Jagex moderator, would have definitely abused his powers. He also said some pretty racist stuff. On August 20th, within RuneScape 3, the Divination skill released. 9 days later, on August 29th, the player I'm Choices achieved level 99 Divination first, before anybody. On the 5th of September this year, Old School RuneScape received its very first original update that didn't exist in the real 2007 game version, being the Nightmare Zone. Jagex had been doing research on gold farming again, and they had found that over 50% of the RuneScape community at some point in their RuneScape careers had purchased gold, and that they wanted to do something about it. On September 25th, Jagex made a decision that they did not take lightly with Old School RuneScape. They had released membership bonds within the game. It was essentially an item in-game that you could redeem for membership after you had bought it off of the Old School RuneScape website. The idea for this update happened when someone had come to ModMark and mentioned a video game that they were playing, in which actual membership for whatever game that was an in-game item that could be purchased. ModMark thought seriously about this, as well as Jagex as a whole, wondering if they could do the same with the OSRS membership. The company had remembered 2012 and how horribly it went with the introductions of microtransactions like this, and everyone was extremely worried and apprehensive. But the Old School RuneScape membership bonds turned out to be a massive success, and still are to this day the only form of microtransactions that exist within Old School RuneScape. Following this update, real-world trading had dropped by 61%. On October 27, 2013, Old School RuneScape player Jebrim became the first player ever within the game version to achieve all level 99 stats. On the 12th of December this year, Jagex CEO Mark Gerhard was forced to resign from Jagex. He was forced because he had disagreed with microtransactions becoming more and more prevalent within RuneScape 3. The board of directors at Jagex wanted to keep adding them, and he didn't want any part of it and tried to fight it, so they voted him out. He would remain CEO another year before leaving, however, due to legal contracts. On the next day, on December 13th, RuneScape 3 player Drumgun was the first to achieve 200 mil XP in the Divination skill. Old School RuneScape ended this year with the player Vestfold achieving rank 1 overall on December 28th, overtaking the rank from the player User, who had previously been rank 1 overall for the past month. On January 16th of this year, OSRS received an update that placed a hit points orb and prayer orb next to the minimap. 1 week later, on January 23rd, the Stronghold Slayer Cave was released at the Gnome Stronghold as well, giving a little more variety when it came to training the Slayer skill. Over in RuneScape 3, on February 4th, the School of Fortune was reworked and renamed to Treasure Hunter. Instead of buying spins, you can now buy keys to open chests. On February 6th, OSRS received a mechanic called Quick Prayers, in which you could click your prayer orb, and it would bring up multiple specific prayers for you that you had chosen to be your quick prayers. Along with this update, the HP orb received the heal option when you were poisoned as well, and the run energy orb that was displayed on the minimap could now be clicked whenever you wanted to run somewhere, instead of having to navigate to the wrench at the bottom of the game frame. Also in the same update, boss monsters' loot that they dropped would now be broadcasted within the game's chat. On March 13th, the wilderness within OSRS received a massive rejuvenation, and many boss monsters and other high-level monsters were put in place around the entire wilderness, making it much more dangerous to venture into. On April 1st, a long-anticipated skill called Sailing was released in Old School RuneScape as an April Fool's joke, and a nod back to the past anticipation players once had when they believed that this skill might have been coming to the game. On April 10th, the Smoke Devil and the Kraken boss was released. On April 24th, the Motherlode Mine was released into OSRS as well, making training mining a bit more interesting than it, already was. On April 28th, RuneScape 3 had received Master Skill Capes. Players who had achieved a virtual level of 120 in skills now had new skill capes to show for it. On May 1st, RuneScape 3 also received portable skilling stations. These stations were very close to the banks that furthered the aspect of social skilling within that game version. On the 8th of May, something that never existed in the original 2007 version of RuneScape was released into OSRS, being bank tabs, which many players found to be extremely useful, especially if you're like me. I am so OCD about that. On May 14th, Drumgun had officially passed Suwami in RuneScape 3, becoming the new rank 1 overall. On May 27th, Old School RuneScape was opened up to free players for the first time for a short period of time. Originally, you needed membership to be able to play OSRS, but during this time, anybody could now try it out. On June 19th, within the game version, Clan Wars was released in the desert. On July 2nd, Drumgun received 200 million XP in the farming skill, capping his account at 5.2 billion XP overall. Because of this, Drumgun would be rank 1 overall in RuneScape 3 permanently until a new skill was released. On July 14th, Legacy Mode was added to RuneScape 3. Within Legacy Mode worlds, you can now play RuneScape 3 without the evolution of combat. The combat instead would be much like the older version of the game. On July 17th in OSRS, Jagex noticed that the monster spawn timers were sort of outdated, and they reworked them to match up to the current player base numbers. Along with this update, loads of boss monster pets were added into the game. On July 24th, the OSRS free-to-play trial period was extended due to the massive success that it was. In the same update, the boss monster kill count numbers were added to the game's chat. On the 7th of August, Jagex had released Old School RuneScape's first ever downloadable client. Prior to this, everyone used a third-party client or their internet browsers. On August 8th, within a period of 2 12-hour-long streams, OSRS player and massively popular YouTuber and streamer Bodhi had raised £50,000 for Macmillan cancer support by live streaming Old School RuneScape. On August 21st, in-game poll booths were released in OSRS. Poll booths were added at every single bank in OSRS, and it made getting votes and feedback from players for Jagex much easier. So far, Jagex had released only poll past updates, in which results of the votes exceeded 75% positive. On the 9th of September, random events were made optional. In the same day, a news post was posted on RuneScape 3's website and Old School RuneScape's website. It was an official letter from Mark Gerhard officially resigning from Jagex and saying goodbye. On September 18th, Jagex released Bounty Hunter within Old School. On September 22nd, Prifddinas was finally released in RuneScape 3. This city had existed on the RuneScape map for 10 years before this, but was never officially implemented until now. On October 11th at RuneFest 2014, Jagex had announced that the original plans for the HTML5 RS3 client had been scrapped. On October 13th, heavily inspired by Faux Freedom and Bodhi's gameplay during this year within Old School, Iron Man and Ultimate Iron Man modes were released within RuneScape 3 and Old School RuneScape. It was also the same day that longtime popular RuneScape YouTuber Chris Archie had officially joined Jagex and would now be known as Mod Archie, hosting many of the company's live streams and videos on their YouTube channels from here on out. On October 16th, the Corporal Beast was released in Old School along with the boss's Spirit Shields and Sigils. On the 12th of December, the Trading Post was released in every bank within OSRS. The Grand Exchange had not existed yet in Old School RuneScape during this time. The Trading Post was implemented because prior to it, players had been trading with other players through a website called Zybez. They would put their items up for sale and be PM'd by another player in-game. They would meet and make trades. The Trading Post would put an end to this, being virtually similar to the previous website itself, but it was in-game instead. December ended 2014 with Old School RuneScape player Sick Nerd achieving rank 1 overall on the high scores. On January 8th, Old School RuneScape received a new boss monster, being Zulrah, the Snake. Next month on February 5th, the Dragon Defender was released as well. With the massive success Old School RuneScape's extended free-to-play trial accumulated, it was decided on February 19th that Old School RuneScape would receive permanent free-to-play servers. This brought so many players to Old School because of this decision from Jagex. On February 26, 2015, the Grand Exchange was released in Old School RuneScape and the Trading Post had been removed from the game. This update was highly controversial and the Old School community was essentially half and half when it came to this decision. After its release, players no longer had to stand at Varrock West Bank spamming that they were selling something. On March 5th, loads of more achievement diaries were put in place in Old School RuneScape. Along with this update, an achievement diary skill cape was also released that players could obtain if they completed them all. On March 13th, RuneScape 3 Iron Man player Dreyri became the first RS3 Iron Man to achieve level 99 in all skills. On March 19th, Old School received an update to the chat dialogues. You can now press numbers when choosing dialogue options, and you can press the spacebar as well to continue to the next dialogues in the chat. On March 23rd, RuneScape 3 saw the release of its 200th quest, being the Dimensions of Disaster. On April Fool's Day this year, Jagex posted a news update on the OSRS page in which they described how they had recently implemented the quest While Gothic Sleeps into the game, as well as Dragon Claws. Dragon Claws weren't out yet in Old School RuneScape. The quest wasn't actually in the game, but a pair of fake Dragon Claws actually were. You could click a wield option on them, and your player would perform the Dragon Claw special attack emote. After the event was over, they were renamed to Diango's Claws. On the 21st of April this year, a Jagex moderator by the name of ModReach was fired for reasons that are still unknown to this day, though it was widely rumored that he was planning to implement a major bug into the game that would have damaged Old School's economy immensely. On April 24th, Jagex proposed a new Old School RuneScape website design to players. Here's what it looked like. This wasn't Old School at all to many, and players quickly shut this poll down with no votes immediately. Jagex still to this day has never proposed a new OSRS website design again. On May 7th, Partnered Slayer was released in Old School, which made training Slayer a little more fun now that you could do it with a friend. On the 21st of May, the World Switcher was released on the logout screen within the game. On June 4th, Old School RuneScape finally received a resizable game screen option, in which players could now play Old School RuneScape in a full screen mode, instead of within a tiny resolution if you were playing on the original fixed mode. On the 25th of June, Platinum tokens were released into the game, and each one of these tokens served as a substitute for one